when you start asking questions, they'll say, well, the problem we have right now is Mexico. It's an organized crime state. Millions of people are pouring into our country. This is a disaster. We need to protect our borders. That's what you're going to hear from Americans. Not, well, we don't care what happens in eastern Ukraine. Ask them where Kiev is. Ask them to show you on a map. Forget it.
They don't know it. Yeah. I definitely see a switch in the mood in the US. The people don't support the war against Ukraine anymore, and they have private problems, inflation, and so on. It's going through the roof. So in Germany, in Western Europe, the narrative in the mainstream media and from the politicians is still that Ukraine has to win the war, and they will win the war. But now we saw the counter strike, which just failed. I think even the Washington Post wrote an article about that it's very hard for the Ukrainian army to win this war, and that the counter strike already failed. So have you been lied to in believing that Ukraine can eventually or actually win this war against Russia? And yeah.
Well, one of the things, and this is very important in my judgment for Germany, the army that was built in Ukraine was an army based on the World War II paradigm. In other words, it's a small replica of what people used 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago militarily, organizationally, equipment-wise, and so forth. Technology and the nature of society have changed dramatically since then. What Ukrainians have been fighting, what we have been up against, backing them, is a very different military establishment that is organized, trained, and equipped for a different kind of warfare. And to understand this evolution, you've got to go back to the 1970s. Look at Ogarkov, Marshal Ogarkov, and his brain trust, which put together the notion of something called a recon strike platform. And the idea was that eventually all the space-based surveillance, overhead imaging capability, targeting capability would be linked to precision weapons on the planet that could then at will target and destroy whatever was necessary. This was the evolution away from the use of nuclear weapons because precision makes the nuclear weapon effectively irrelevant. The problem with nuclear weapons when they were devised and even now is that it's too destructive. There's no point in using them. You ruin the atmosphere, destroy the country or the force that you're trying to defeat. What you really want to do is find a way to bring the war to an end with minimal damage. You want to profit, if you will, from war, not destroy everything. This is why in this book that you mentioned in your introduction, I wrote called Transformation Under Fire was an attempt to come to terms with this on the Western side so that we could begin to look at warfare differently. It failed miserably because everyone's very comfortable living in the past. For your German audience, they need to think in terms of the old Prussian military establishment that marched out to Jena, Auerstedt to face the Grande Armée of Napoleon. They were utterly annihilated. Well, we Americans and our allies are stuck on the road to Jena, Auerstedt. We got to get off of it. Warfare has changed. So when the Germans started investing money in building the German military establishment, they need a new military establishment, not the old one. And if you go back to the interwar period, the problem that the Germans had in the 20s and the 30s was that they were only able to modernize a portion of the force, and they only reorganized a portion of the force. The vast majority of the Wehrmacht was still organized into these large infantry divisions left over from the First World War that lacked transport, firepower, mobility. And this hurt Germany badly during the war. Well, we are in the same boat now, all of us together. We've got to make profound changes all across the boards. And I don't know that anyone is prepared to do it yet. But we certainly don't have to wait to find out what the Ukrainians found out the hard way. That what we told them to do, how we organized them, how we equipped them was the wrong answer.
Definitely. So what do you think when this war will end? Will it end next year?
I think that in the absence of any leadership from Europe, if no one steps forward from Europe independently of this thing you call the EU or NATO or anything else and says it's time for us to hold a conference, sit down with the Russians, and help the Ukrainians bring this to an end. If that does not happen, then I suspect Ukraine will eventually simply surrender. The Russians will move to whatever positions they think they need to occupy to protect themselves, and then they will wait.
Okay. What happens to Zelensky then if they surrender?
Well, I suspect a private plane will be sent to fetch him, and he'll fly off to Venice or Cyprus or Israel or somewhere else where he can live comfortably in one of his mansions. I suspect he'll probably want to go to Miami. Uh, that's my expectation. I mean, this whole thing rests on a mountain of corruption. The billions have been lost on this proposition.
Exactly. Even weapons, we don't know if they're on the black market, for example. We heard that some ISIS fighters already have some German tanks or something like that. But anyhow, we spent billions of dollars, and some of them even went perhaps to politicians or to Zelensky. And in this Time magazine article, the advisor of Zelensky already mentioned that that they are very corrupt and that the people take everything they can. A couple of days ago, there was one, I think it was a mayor. He had like $4 million in euro and in dollar. So where did this money come from? But anyhow, it's a corrupt country. It was corrupt, very much corrupt before the war. It's even more corrupt now. But we put so much energy into it, and now we are there with nothing in our hands. So what do you think? When will the people in the West wake up? And do you think that, because the attitude in the German press is, oh, if we don't stop Putin, he will come to Eastern Europe, he will invade Poland. You think this is realistic or is it delusional?
Well, that's just nonsense. It's never been true. It's less true now than it was before the war began. It's less true now because, first of all, there is no incentive to wage war on Europe if you're a Russian. How do you profit from sustaining a war against Germany, France, or anybody else? You can't. It's a waste of time, money, and resources. If anything, the Russians want to get back to business. They want to return to some measure of normalcy. There's no interest in occupying anything. The other thing is, why would you want to occupy countries where everyone hates you? I mean, this is insane. I mean, do you think the Poles are going to roll over for the Russians? The Russians certainly don't. And they don't want to be bothered. You know, by the time the Warsaw Pact fell apart, most of what the Soviets regarded as their imperium, their empire, whether it was Cuba or Poland or anywhere else, these places were drains on Soviet resources, manpower. It was a losing proposition. Territorial imperialism was exactly what Bismarck warned. It was a huge waste of money. There was no return on the investment. It was all mortgaged to vanity. What a waste of time. It's unnecessary. So no, there's no danger of Russians marching west to do anything except get access to goods and automobiles and other things in Germany. They don't need weapons for that.
So there are rumors, and I also read something in the Washington Post that there are already sorry, that U.S. politicians and Europe politicians already forced the Zelensky regime to get in peace talks with Russia. Did you hear something about it? Do you think it's realistic that they really try to force them right now after 1.5 years of war and senseless war and millions, well, not millions, but 100,000 of deaths, that they really put them into the on the table for diplomatic ceasefire or freedom talks, peace talks?
The the amount of money that we have to pay on an annual basis to service our sovereign national debt is now over $1 trillion. And $1 trillion is roughly the amount of money we spend on defense and the supporting intelligence agencies. So, of course, yes, you've got this insane regime under Biden that has bankrupted us even further, wasted our resources, revealed, in my judgment, through stupidity, that we are not invulnerable, invincible by any means. And so, yes, I think that you had Secretary of State Burns, certainly the director of the CIA, or excuse me, director of CIA Burns, probably Blinken to some extent, certainly Austin in the Department of Defense, who said, look, we'll continue to support you, but it's time for you to find out what the Russians want and bring this to a close, because we can't support it anymore. It has no support publicly, and we simply can't afford it. Otherwise, unless something is done, you'll see a replay of Afghanistan. What did we do? We packed up, as I told you before about Vietnam, and left. And, remember, people said if you leave Vietnam, the communists in North Vietnam will march all the way across Southeast Asia. There'll be war for years. Nonsense. And what if we leave Iraq? The Iraqi parliament has already voted us out of the country. They did that in 2020. Had a vote and said, get out. We don't want you here. We still have over 5,000 troops in Iraq. Why? Because everything is mortgaged to vanity. We are concealing the true scale of our failure, of our strategic defeat. If you leave, people will say, oh, well, look, they left. It's a failure. That's the fear in Washington. But in truth, back to my original point, you tell the average American, well, we left Iraq. He'll say, I thought we did that a few years ago. He could care less. This is what people don't get. Even our politicians don't understand it. They say, well, how do I explain this in the next election that we failed in Ukraine, we failed in Iraq, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Libya, and you just go down the list. It's not going to be a topic because the topic is back where we started. It's exactly what you enumerated. That's the topic that matters to Americans.
Yeah, talking about elections, what do you think? Who will win?
Well, first, I don't know how these elections will go. In other words, I'm not sure we'll get that far. There's an awful lot of discontent inside the United States with the way the last election was conducted in 2020. Your viewers may not understand this because you have across Germany fairly uniform conduct of elections. In other words, whether you're in Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, whatever, it's uniform. It's not true in the United States. And this goes back to our Constitution, which everyone holds up as this holy relic, which can never change. The problem was in 1787 when they said we've got to figure out how we're going to hold elections in the United States. They said, well, the federal government has no money. And until World War I, the federal government represented less than 2% of gross national product in the United States. America is a bottom-up country. That's how we grew. That's how we developed. We didn't have steering mechanisms in Washington at all, very little. And so they said, well, we'll have to give the power to the states because the states, the individual colonies, had plenty of money. They can afford to run the elections. That has stuck since 1787. In other words, when you go to Massachusetts, you go to West Virginia, you go to Portland, Washington, how they conduct their elections depends on the state government and whatever uniform regulations they have in that state. But they'll be different across the country. Well, if elections are different from state to state, how do you ensure anymore in a country of 330, 340 million that those elections are free and fair? It's a huge question. Now, let's assume that we march into the election in the fall of 2024. Are we going to see a different outcome from the one that we saw in 2020? We don't know because, again, the elections are not uniformly conducted. There are irregularities depending upon what county, what district, what precinct, what state you happen to be in. And I'll give you a quick example of my own personal experience. I remember this vividly because in 1960, which tells you how old I am, I was 7 years of age. My mother was a quote unquote judge of elections. In other words, she had been elected in the precinct to run the electoral process. Our precinct was overwhelmingly Ukrainian and Polish, people that had come from Poland and Ukraine, their children. They were all violent anti-communists, as you can imagine. They voted overwhelmingly